We are live. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and today I will be discussing visions of the future with a guest, Demian Zivkovic, who is 23 years old, a student of artificial intelligence and philosophy, and founder and president of the Arma'thwynn Society, an international transhumanist think tank comprised of a group of transhumanism-oriented professionals, students, and entrepreneurs interested in the interdisciplinary approach to advancing transhumanist technologies. Demian and I have been conversing for about a year online, and he has been involved in several endeavors, including interviewing Professor Aubrey de Grey, one of the leading biogerontologists who is working on the problem of senescence. He's also organizing a transhumanism lecture in the Netherlands now, and Spreading Death is Wrong, my illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension in the Netherlands.
You're not broadcasting.
Demian, are you there?
Yes, I am. I was just waiting for you to finish your introductions.
Excellent,
I'm very pleased to be on here. How do you do?
I am doing very well. Let me pause for a moment here because I'm being told that this is not broadcasting. So if I may take a moment to resolve this.
That would be a good idea, I'd say.
Yes. All right, it seems that the broadcast is indeed taking place. So anyway, with that introduction, Demian, since you are a transhumanist and you are oriented toward the future and toward indefinite life extension, I'd like you to talk about what your vision is for a brighter future that could happen within our lifetimes, within the next 20 to 30 years, and hopefully would enable us to lengthen our lifetimes without any upper limit.
Well, of course, that's a very broad question. So there are several disciplines in which I can think. I mean, you have biotechnology, bioinformatics, you have artificial intelligence, you have all kinds of schools of transhumanist thought. And the question is, which would you like to focus on? The life extension part or the AI, human augmentation, intelligence augmentation? Where do you want to go with this?
Certainly. Let's start with life extension, and then we'll see if we can branch out to some of the others, but I think life extension is a particularly important one because it could buy us time to see advances in all of the other fields as well, and ultimately if we're not alive to experience and enjoy the future, then all we could do is really speculate about it from our present vantage point, but we'll never really see how it turns out. So life extension, I would say, is the area of greatest interest.
I would agree with you on that. And what I really see right now is there's like two schools of thought here. There's the people who directly go for biotechnology, like the sense approach, who are most interested in finding out a method or a collection of methods which can extend our life, which can slow down aging. And then you have people who believe that the best way to go about this is to do it through artificial intelligence and bioinformatics. And they believe that by developing these technologies on AI or general artificial general intelligence could solve these problems for us. And one of the main questions that I am currently thinking about is which way is the best way to go about this, or maybe a combination of this. To give you an example, I personally am studying artificial intelligence. My goal is to to set a project as an entrepreneur to understand the technology behind AI and to use this technology in business. Well, for example, my fiance has chosen to study nanobiology. So that's different ways to go about it, and I think that the near future will be very exciting in terms of which of these ways or how these ways will develop.
Excellent. So I'd like your opinion as somebody who has been immersed in the field of AI with regard to how rapid and how extensive the progress in that area has been over, say, the past 5 years. And do you believe that rate of progress, if it continues, is going to be enough for that approach to produce indefinite life extension as well as other major technological breakthroughs? Or do you think a deliberate acceleration of the pace of progress would be needed in order for those goals to be met in time for us?
Well, I would say that it's a very difficult question because within the field of AI, you have a lot of different paradigms. You have, of course, hardware limitations. I'm sure you're all familiar with Moore's law, which says that the amount of transistors will double every 2 years, I believe. I'm not sure what the exact time frame is, but the point is that it's an exponential growth, right? But about 220, 225, we are going to look at the physical upper limits of computation speed with the current paradigm. So we will have to look towards different methods of computation. I see very great promise in optical computation, and for some problems, quantum computation, but people think that quantum computers are in every way better than regular computers, but that's just not true. They're better for some special problems, for example, in cryptography or some very specific issues for which we have to find new methods of hardware like 3D microchips or optical computing. And the other thing is the way with which you construct artificial intelligence, because the paradigm which has been dominant in the past 50 years was to mostly use logic, like if-then rules. You program by modeling certain cognitive processes. You don't actually build, for example, a brain. You don't copy the physical structure of the brain. You look at cognitive science, you look which functions we have found the brain to have, and you try to model those. But recently, it's been more and more common to explore possibilities of building processor architectures or novel methods of computation which are much more natural. For example, in Europe, we have the Human Brain Project, where the EU is funding around €1 billion to simulate a human brain. And this is not done by actually trying to model cognitive processes, but by actually modeling the structure of the human brain, the neurological fundaments which cause our thoughts to emerge. And I really think that right now it really depends on which way AI develops. And related to that is also the field of computational linguistics, which is very important because it allows us to communicate with AI much better. Because if you have an artificial intelligence system which can understand natural language, for example, Google has been very invested in this the past few years. You have Ray Kurzweil working for them, and they are trying to make computers more capable of understanding language. And I think that's a very large barrier, because computers understanding language and being capable of interpreting on a human or even higher level would greatly improve efficiency of the entire economy worldwide, which I think would of course be an impulse for new technologies to develop and, well, accelerating returns basically.
Indeed. So Ray Kurzweil essentially posits a very ambitious and some would say very optimistic vision of the future. His concept of the singularity essentially projects that by the year 2045 there will be an artificial intelligence with superior capabilities to that of a human mind in every respect that would be able essentially to recursively improve itself and generate ever higher amounts of intelligence, ever higher levels of ability. And he says one of the essential components of that future would be a merger of human intelligence and artificial intelligence, so that we would not be opposed to these beings, and they would not be so much apart from us, but rather their abilities and our abilities would become integrated into an entity that has essentially the advantages of humans today, the advantages of computers today, and then some. So judging by the trends that you discussed and the possible future paradigms that you discussed, what is your opinion on how likely that trajectory is to occur on the time frame that Ray Kurzweil is projecting it to occur?
Well, I certainly find it to be an optimistic, although not impossible estimate. I also think that to speak of a general artificial intelligence which is superior to humans in every way is a bit of a populist way to phrase things, because superiority at this point is something that's very difficult to objectively measure. I mean, you can take, for example, the Turing test, but if you do a Turing test, you only really test how well a machine does in fooling a human that they're talking to a human being.
Mhm.
And what I do see very likely to happen is more and more integration of technology into our bodies. And right now, we are already seeing this trend with artificial hips. The first artificial hearts have recently been tested, I believe. There are people who have been living with artificial hearts. You have brain implants for people with Parkinson's. You have all these kinds of technologies which are improving, which first come from the medical community. But I can imagine that as these devices get better, that either companies will capitalize on this by making better and better solutions, which will eventually overcome the natural limitations of humans, which will have a natural consequence of people improving themselves with technologies. Just like you had, for example, in the 50s of the past century, you had the advent of plastic surgery. If you in the past told people that they would go to a surgeon to become more beautiful, people would probably think it's unnatural, weird, what say you, but right now it's frowned upon by some people, but it's generally accepted as a part of modern society. So I think that augmentation of body and mind will go through about the same trajectory. And the advent of these things will most likely come from commercial medical businesses combined with do-it-yourself hackers who take this equipment and find out how it works and use it to get features which were not originally intended but which can be used to increase our abilities. For example, you already have in the UK, I believe, you have the Cyborg Foundation, where Neil Harbison, I believe, has technology with which he can use a sensor to hear ultraviolet and infrared through bone conduction. And I think this is the how will I say this, the paradigm which technology will take. And to come back to your original question about general AI by 200, what year did you say?
2045, that's the year that Ray Kurzweil gives for his projection.
Yes. Well, personally, I would say that by that time we'll have very advanced AI, and AI which is in many ways integrated into our bodies. For example, I can imagine that with the advent of augmented reality with Google Glass and some of the most modern smartphones, this technology is now in its infancy, and in another 15 years, I would say it will have matured, just like the mobile technology, which was in its infancy 15 years ago, has matured. And I think that these technologies will become much more easier to integrate in our everyday life. So, of course, artificial intelligence which will follow to make them more intuitive, more responsive, and with natural language processing and exponentially larger databases in which an AI could have knowledge about the world, or communication with machines will become much more intuitive. If you make one more leap between this technology and, for example, neural interfacing, which is already being used to give amputees prosthetic robotic limbs, or to restore some functions, I can't see it as impossible to imagine that this will also be used for communication, which will be possible to use in intelligence augmentation. So I'm very curious to see about what will happen. I do think that Kurzweil's prediction about it being superior in every way is a bit optimistic, but I don't think that a future similar to his is very probable, possible, and likely, only on maybe a bit of a bigger time frame.
Very interesting thoughts here, and there are a lot of directions that we could take this conversation. Now, definitely the route of incremental augmentation of human beings, both biological augmentations and electronic augmentations, would seem to me to be the most plausible route that this would take. Now, there's also, of course, a great parallel you made to the rise of mobile phones, whereas in the late 1980s, early 1990s, very few people had them. They were very clunky, of limited functionality, and really were only associated with the wealthiest of the wealthy. Now, virtually anywhere in the world, there's an extensive presence of mobile phones. Indeed, sometimes the poorest people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to more data and more connectivity than the wealthiest and most powerful leaders of the world had in 1990. So that's definitely an example of how this kind of progress could occur on the timescale that we're looking at. Of course, the big question, and in my mind, the big unknown, is that of public acceptance. And certainly mobile phones have garnered a great deal of public acceptance. Indeed, their prevalence is one of the biggest changes between 10 years ago and today, even if we're looking just out in the general world, how people behave, what people have with them in their environments. On the other hand, I worry about whether the boundaries of public acceptance may be too restrictive. And a good example of that has been the recent, let's say, shutting down of the Google Glass Explorer program that Google announced. Essentially, Google had released Google Glass, made it available to a select group of software developers for a rather expensive price, $1,500. And then they were to report back to Google with their findings or suggestions about how to improve it. And it was widely expected that the next stage would be to release it to the general public, just as a consumer product. And instead of doing that, just a few days ago, Google announced that it would be shutting down the Explorer program, but not immediately releasing the product for consumer use. Instead, it would be putting it back into development for an unspecified amount of time. And what worries me about that is it seems like there has been a public backlash, a public reluctance to accept Google Glass, and that's very unfortunate in my view, because I think it could be an excellent technology to provide ready access to information and a kind of augmentation that is a blend between what a mobile phone would be and what more embedded devices of the future would look like. So what do you think about that example and what it might tell us? Or do you think it's just a bump in the road and we will overcome it in our technological progress?
Well, what I would say is that technology, for it to be readily accepted, it needs to be intuitive, it needs to be easy to use, and it needs to add features in which people are really looking for to enhance their daily lives. Usually, that is much more important in whether technology will be embraced than the preconceived notions people have about it before it's released. And with Google Glass, it's of course it's the first of its kind. It had a lot of things that can be improved upon. There are quite a lot of limitations to the hardware, to the software, and I think it's actually a smart move of Google to pull it back to development, because unless this technology is very user-friendly, unless it's very mature, unless it's a very mature technology which works how it's supposed to work, people won't accept it. You've seen the same thing with the first smartphones. They were very buggy. There were a lot of bad interfaces in it, and people just didn't know what to do with them, even though they were very interesting technological devices. So you see this group of early adopters who are very interested in the technology, who are very interested to develop in it for it. And these people generally are like the front row who get all the bugs out of it and provide feedback on how a company can improve a product. And I think that Google Glass is going along the same road in this. So I wouldn't say that the reluctance to accept it came necessarily because it was a futuristic product. I rather think that the reason people didn't want to use it was rather because, how do I put this? It wasn't yet offering what people are expecting from such an expensive product. And it's also a lot of people didn't yet know how to integrate it in their daily lives because it costs a lot of effort to configure it, to use it efficiently. And that was too much of a hassle for people for what seemed to be a novelty electronic toy.
So it seems then that the reluctance of people to accept a particular technology, or even more specifically a particular device, is not so much from a hard upper limit to their tolerance of emerging technologies, but rather from a more mundane standpoint of how easy is it to use, how accessible is it, how much of an immediate improvement to people's lives it offers. And it seems to me, based on what you're saying, that if people experience too much frustration or too many steps in getting a device to work and to do what they want it to do, or if the immediate impact on their lives is not as apparent as they might want it to be, then they'll be reluctant to accept it. But perhaps a subsequent generation of the technology that essentially just gives people that immediate capacity at their fingertips, or perhaps in the future even the ability to achieve something with a thought or another gesture, that would be more readily accepted just because it would be easy, it would be right there, and people won't have to bother too much with it.
Well, yes, exactly. That's the point which I was trying to make, and which I clearly conveyed very well. And I think that what you've seen with personal computers, like a computer in the 60s and the 70s, it was really a nerd thing to do, you know, to have a computer. You had these Lisp machines who were pretty much could do most of the things a modern desktop can do, at least a desktop from 15 years ago, but you had to program the whole thing. It had limited capacity, and people just didn't know how they can readily integrate this machine into their lives, because to use simple programs to save documents, you had to do a lot of work, and it had an image of, you know, nerdiness, geekiness. It wasn't fancy, flashy, it wasn't hip. So what we need to do is we need to have this technology which does what it has to do and also has design and the image which people want to have. It has to have this hip, flashy, status symbol thing about it, where people can really do something quickly that allows them to do something you can't do without the actual technology. And I think that when you have a first generation or even a second generation of a new novel device, you have these people, these early adopters, who basically are very enthusiastic, usually quite intelligent people, who really discover the possibilities of the technology, discover the possibilities of the software, of the hardware, who write their own software for it, and create applications for themselves, for their family, friends, which then are remade and repackaged by professional programmers and corporations for the general public with ease to use and a better interface, and of course the hardware to support this much more how will I say it, intuitive way of dealing with it. Because, for example, if you look at even programming itself, like 30 years ago, you had the first programming languages like COBOL, or you had assembly, which was the first language past binary. And it was very difficult to make an even simple program in it. Nowadays, you have, say, Visual Basic or Java, and most people with some education can learn how to do basic things with these programs. While programming is still a niche thing, it's become much more widely accepted and much more easier to do, which also means that there are much more developers who create software, who create all kinds of applications for the general public, which in turn makes it that there are more programs, more functionality, causing more public acceptance of the technology. I mean, if you had a computer 20, 25 years ago, you were like this nerdy, techie, engineer kind of person. Nowadays, you're weird if you don't have a computer, and I think that that's the stages that technology goes through until it's widely accepted by the general public.
So it seems to me, in that case, it's essentially a matter of time, and the challenge is for those people who want to bring a technology into wider circulation to make it more accessible. Now, do you think there's a role for small-scale entrepreneurs or activists or, say, groups within the transhumanist and life extensionist movement for doing that, or would it necessarily require the resources of a very large, well-funded entity, an entity like, say, Google, for instance, who has definitely been at the forefront of these kinds of emerging technologies? But is there a way that, let's say, smaller scale actors can contribute to this and can help speed the process along so that we can see the consumer versions of these technologies, the widely accepted versions, earlier than we would otherwise?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think that both sides, both the large-scale corporations as well as the smaller, more individual or small groups, have a role to play in this process, because it's often very community-driven, smaller developers who create all kinds of smaller applications which really bring out the power that the technology has to offer. For example, if you look at smartphones and you just open the Play Store, you have millions of apps. Many of them have been written by individuals or small teams, which all add to the versatility that these devices now offer to our lives. And many of these apps have been started by people just like you and me, or smaller teams of developers, students, that just saw the capabilities of the technology and decided to offer a product. And that's like what I said the um, just a few minutes ago. You have these early adopters who have a large role to play in first using their motivation and understanding the technology and then creating something. And for example, when you look at projects on Kickstarter, like the Oculus Rift, for example, which has been the buzz of the past year, year and a half on virtual reality, it started as a like a garage project, and now you have all these big companies who are inspired by the technology, who are all really like trying to make their own VR kits and corner the market on it as soon as possible. And that these are all ways that people can contribute. You can like really show the public what's possible and get people excited for it. And then you have like these trend watchers and corporate researchers who see these hypes and go along with them because there's money to be made. If you have a community of people excited for a certain possibility, you instantly have a business or an entrepreneur who wants to capitalize on this. That's just the way the economy works. And I think that the role of smaller agents and would really be to get people excited to make applications for this new technology, to make it modern, more hip, to you know just keep the buzz going.
Mhm. Yes, very good thoughts there, and I certainly agree with you. There seems to be a role for smaller agents within this larger ecosystem of emerging technologies that's created by the combined interactions of everybody, not just the big companies, but also the kick-started projects, the small-scale entrepreneurs, and if we could add to that, then we could make a difference. Now, another question that is related to this is the process we've talked about seems to provide a lot of room for hope that we will see these technologies relatively soon. While we're still young, if senescence hasn't been reversed yet, and those technologies will facilitate more rapid research into ways to reverse senescence, to keep us biologically young longer and to prevent us from dying along the time frame of our ancestors. Now, do you foresee any great threats or any great obstacles to realizing that vision? Anything that could derail it? And if so, what would you consider to be the greatest threats of that sort?
Well, there are, of course, a lot of things which can slow the process down. You have, for example, the whole geopolitical unrest with Russia becoming a bit more less free, more dictatorial under Putin. You have the NSA, you have all these issues, all these problems, which at this point are not a large threat to the economy, but if things could escalate, that can certainly slow down progress, slow down the exchange of free information, slow down the exchange of ideas, and make people more worried, more conservative in accepting new technologies and spending money because they're worried for the future. And you really don't want that to happen. And I think that the old enemies of reason are to blame here. Irrationality, nationality, a fanatical religion, all these things are actors on the world stage which prove to be, if I may say, evil and detrimental force on mankind. And I'm not even blaming a certain group of people or a certain religion or whatever. I'm simply blaming the more abstract universal concepts which human nature has cruelly endowed mankind with. And I really think that if you look at it now, I don't see governments, say, outright prohibiting life extension. I do think that governments can do a lot of damage to the economic and growth of countries, of societies, to the geopolitical stability, but I rather think that all kinds of regulations slow things down. But you already have these um, medical technology, these medical treatments, which really do improve quality of life and extend life for quite a bit. I mean, everyone can get some anti-aging drugs, like for example metformin, rapamycin, and similar drugs. I mean, you can't like get them everywhere due to government, but you can import them, you can order them online. If you really want them, they're there for you. So I don't really see these technologies being hampered in a direct way. I rather think that economy and stability, which are necessary for these technologies to emerge, has to be maintained.
Absolutely, and I think you have articulated the threats extremely well. One prospect that really worries me and has worried me over the past year is any sort of escalation of the conflict in Ukraine from a local conflict to any sort of war involving major world powers, irrespective of what one thinks about who is in the right in that situation. And for me, it's very hard to find anybody who is virtuous or moral other than the ordinary civilians who are being bombed and shot and killed every single day there. But irrespective of what one's position there is, it seems to me that if either side attempts to escalate the situation and use more force, that could rapidly lead to things spiraling out of control. And of course, the worst outcome would be some sort of world war where a lot of infrastructure, a lot of resources, a lot of lives are destroyed. And as you pointed out, that would have a very deleterious effect on people's mindsets. People will no longer be looking forward to a hopeful future. Instead, they'll try to entrench themselves and protect themselves however they can from the chaos that's happening out there. So I definitely think it's a top priority to prevent that kind of escalation from happening. And of course, with regard to political obstacles, often there are special interest groups that are vested in the status quo that lobby for special protections, even if these are protections for obsolete ways of doing business or obsolete technologies. They try to make it harder for new competitors to enter the field. And unfortunately, it's been a tricky problem. Libertarians have tried to address it for many decades, and they've outlined, say, the public choice angle on how a lot of governments work and how that's not an optimal way to lead to benefits for humankind. They've also outlined various abstract economic arguments for why certain interventionist policies will not work, like an expansionary monetary policy or wage and price controls, and yet we still see a lot of those policies de facto in place. So with the barriers that we discussed, the geopolitical barriers, the barriers from bad policies, entrenched special interests, what do you think are our best chances for overcoming them? Do you think that the dynamic of technological innovation that's currently in place will by itself be sufficient to overcome them, or does something else need to happen? Does something else need to change in order for these threats to become negligible?
Well, I think that that's a very interesting question because, you have like various schools of thought in politics, and I think we have to refrain from going with the more radical and difficult to accept political theories. I personally identify myself as a moderate libertarian, a classical liberal. I'm for more liberty, lower taxes, but to go and try to implement a radical new system like anarcho-capitalism, I just don't see it very likely to happen in the next 20 years. What I see with technology, how it's technology and liberty have this dynamic. First, you have like emerging very expensive technologies that require centralized oversight to be implemented at all. For example, in the 70s, you had the first television stations, which were set up by the government. You had like 2 or 3 channels, and that's because there weren't many entrepreneurs who wanted to take the risk of setting up a TV station, which could take millions or even billions of dollars. And you had like little choice. You had these government programs, and eventually, when technology got cheaper, you got private businesses who got into the whole television market. Then you got the internet, which came along, YouTube, Vimeo, and all these websites, which really drove down the production costs of technology, of broadcasting content to a large audience. And this is what I call the decentralization which follows technological advancement. And I think the same things can happen with a lot of other things, like, for example, security or medicine, which will allow people to do much more things by themselves without centralizing authority. And I think this is really the best way of achieving more liberty and achieving more personal responsibility in people. Because, if you have if the government is the only agent who can provide a service, or at least the most likely agent to provide a service in the current status quo, it's not very likely that people are going to shy away from the government. And I can really understand that. But I do think that it's a system which will have to be gradually improved, enhanced, and eventually changed. So, like, about the threats, how to make these negligible. I think that's quite a difficult question because at this point I would say the threats are present but not very severe. For example, the largest conflict at the current moment is the crisis in Ukraine. I mean, I don't see, for example, Russia actually invading Europe, invading all of Ukraine. I think that the annexation of the Crimea has followed the communist decision of Khrushchev to give the Crimea away, because the Crimea was originally Russian and Russia has lost a lot of face because the fall of the Soviet Union, and the average people in Russia don't like this. They think that the West is like taking over and they're like encroaching on their identity, on their culture. And Putin is smart and sees these sentiments, and he thinks like, I'm gonna make Russia big again because I'll get the support of people, and he'll get power because of this and solidify his position. But I don't think that the Russian people are waiting for an all-out war with America or Europe. They just want to take back what they think is Russian and protect the interests of Russians. And Putin uses this, abuses this to solidify his power. And so I don't think that there's a radical threat, but there are these developments that we certainly do have to keep watch of and respond in the most rational way and make sure that the opinion makers, that the media, the intellectuals, the entrepreneurs, that they steer the general public away from these nationalist, destructive sentiments, and that we all keep a clear mind and that we evaluate what's happening in the sense of what's really good in our interests and not give in to short-sighted sentiments which eventually lead to a war with only losers and no winners.
Yes, and I agree with you. It seems to me, and you mentioned previously, these are general human tendencies from a more barbaric time: nationalism, dogmatism, tribalism. I would also say the tactic of brinkmanship that existed during the Cold War, where each side would try to escalate the situation as far as they could possibly go without it turning into an all-out nuclear war, just so that they could press for concessions from the other side. And those are very destructive mentalities. And of course, to me, it's always been interesting to think about essentially the entire mix of human characteristics, both good and bad, and how they're distributed throughout the human species. Clearly, some of us are more rational than others. Some of us are more virtuous than others. Some of us can show more restraint, can show more tolerance, more of a desire for peace, whereas others are more inclined to press the metaphorical trigger when it comes to that. And really, of course, the big question is, do we have enough people with the good characteristics distributed all throughout human societies to prevent real tragedies from occurring? And I definitely agree with your analysis of what Putin is trying to do. I have no love for Putin. I think he's a dictator who violates the rights of his own subjects. On the other hand, I would find it very implausible for him to try to even regain all of Ukraine, much less the Baltic countries or Georgia or Poland, as some in the West are fearing today. I just think it would be tremendously unwise for him to try to do that, and for all of his evil, he is not stupid, and he will not try to push the situation to that point unless he feels that he has no choice, unless he feels that he will be humiliated otherwise. If the West tries to press him too hard militarily, then he might think it's a matter of his dignity or a matter of national pride to respond accordingly, in which case it could be a very tragic situation. So I think we both agree it's really important for cooler heads to prevail in this and to see the conflict in perspective as something that could be contained, could remain a local conflict, even though even the local scope of it is very tragic. Now, I also was curious. What do you think about the concept of the moral progress of humankind? The idea that over the centuries, people have generally tended toward more virtuous behavior. Not in every instance, but we've seen the abolition of institutions that have been with humankind for most of its history, say slavery or the subjugation of women in the West, have largely gone away. And also we have seen eras, at least, of greater peace and in wars fewer casualties per capita than have been the case in the past. Steven Pinker has a great book on this called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is a very comprehensive compendium of the decline of violence throughout human history. What do you think about that view? Do you perceive a lot of this kind of moral progress occurring in recent history, and do you project that it would continue, that the distribution of human characteristics would continue to change to a more favorable one, not just because of the influences of technology, but other socioeconomic types of influences, perhaps?
Well, I don't think it's very possible to separate culture from technology, because these things are completely integrated. Technology is part of our culture. It shapes our language. It shapes the way that we look at the world. It shapes our identities. It shapes every single facet of the human experience and the human condition. And that's a trend that's just more and more likely to keep going. And I would say that you can't really see morality in just going up or down. You have very great amount of different aspects to morality, and many of them have like improved over the time. And I would say that there is a net gain. There is a net gain in, for example, values like individuality, self-development, self-valuation, respect of other people's rights. But I also think that there is, again, a counter side to that, as there is to everything. And I think that we, in our attempt to nuance everything, we often forget to show appreciation for the things that really are black and white. You know, you have like people who try to nuance even things like death away, who are like, it's not really that bad and it's natural, etc. And on the other side, you have, of course, tolerance, which is a very good thing, a beautiful thing in all of society. But we have to make sure that we don't become tolerant of things that are destructive, evil, and irrational. And that is something that I see happen a lot, often on the left side of politics, because the liberals usually were the champions of tolerance and respect, etc. But nowadays it often also shows respect for example, religious freedoms over freedom of expression, these kind of things. And while I do think that these sentiments are on the losing side, they are certainly there to slow down our progress. And that's something which we really have to look out for, because I once read this marvelous quote, which is, keep an open mind, but don't let your brains fall out.
Yes.
And that's something I would really like to tell modern society.
Absolutely. And of course, we see a very prominent and very disturbing example of this kind of tendency, this political correctness, essentially trying to tolerate what are heinous atrocities. The recent shootings in Paris at the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and then at a kosher grocery store by essentially 3 Islamic fundamentalist fanatics who were offended at cartoons that a magazine published. And it does disturb me that so many people, when they expressed their reactions to those attacks, qualified their condemnation in some way. They were saying, well, I condemn the attack, but you really shouldn't offend other people's religions, or something of that nature. And to me, it seems the distinction between somebody who says something offensive, and pretty much anything is going to offend somebody, and the distinction, and on the other hand, somebody who kills because of taking offense, that distinction is so huge that there should not be an attempt to compare the two in the same breath. It does seem to me like there has been this acceptance that everything is a shade of gray. Everything can have some sort of excuse or justification for it. Of course, in the name of some higher ideal like tolerance. But I agree, we should not have tolerance for intolerance, and we should not have tolerance for the kinds of reactionary behaviors that are going to threaten everybody's freedom and everybody's progress and our ability to realize the bright future that we are talking about. So that, of course, gives rise to a whole series of difficult questions, because one important challenge that we have as people who respect freedom and who want to keep a free society is, how do we deal with violently intolerant individuals and behaviors without sacrificing our freedoms, without essentially inflicting collateral damage on the rest of us. And unfortunately, we've seen that scenario play out in the United States too. You mentioned the NSA surveillance, and that's something I definitely want to touch on, not just because of the societal implications, but also how it reflects on uses of certain technologies. But the NSA surveillance was in large part a reaction to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And the United States offered, in my view, a very strong response to those attacks in terms of trying to hunt down the perpetrators, trying to prevent future attacks. But in doing that, it cast a very wide net, and it targeted a lot of people who couldn't possibly have been terrorists or potential terrorists or terror suspects, perhaps because of political correctness, because of trying to implement a policy that doesn't appear to single anybody out. So they screen everybody. They spy on everybody. They're not discriminating. They're spying on you and me, even though we have nothing to do with that sort of threat. And that, I would say, is the big challenge. And one of the reasons why this is particularly relevant to our discussion is because it will frame how technology is going to be used in the future. The NSA right now has far more advanced surveillance capabilities than ordinary citizens do. There has been a lot of discussion about surveillance, the possibility of ordinary citizens essentially watching the watchers, watching the government, watching the police to make sure there's no malfeasance. But the fact is, the NSA has a lot more tools at its disposal to spy on us then we have tools to determine what the NSA is doing or what other powerful entities are doing. So where do you see the role of technology in achieving a society that does react to threats appropriately, but also protects the liberties of innocent citizens so that technology isn't used as a weapon against peaceful people?
Well, what I often see is the case is that these large-scale surveillance programs are quite ineffective against people who really want to protect themselves against them. I mean, I can set up a computer in a few hours which can talk about whatever you want it to talk about, and you won't be spied upon, even if the NSA wants to do it. I mean, if the NSA really wants to, hack your machine, etc., they probably will find a way to do it, but these mass surveillance, these general data analysis systems are quite easy to circumvent with encryption and with just educating yourself, not using the the most popular apps, but the more small-scale developer systems which are made to counteract this surveillance, and that's technology that's made available to ordinary citizens if they are interested in their privacy, obviously. The thing is here is that all these methods of response are basically fear politics. People, the government is not that interested in the terrorists, they're interested in the sentiment amongst citizens that they are in threat. So they respond to this to win favor from their electorates. Well, and really, when I'm looking at this problem, I would really like to call everyone to be rational and look at statistics. If you, for example, look at the threats of being the victim of a terrorist attack and compare this to the threat of being victim of age-related disease, you really understand that terrorism is a terrible, heinous moral crime, but it's not one of the big problems of our society. The big problems of our society is the terror, fear, and irrational backlash that the terrorism causes. That's the real damage, not the few people who get killed by it. Of course, it's a terrible thing that these people get killed, and I don't want to downplay the horrible tragedy that happens to them and their families, but I also don't want to downplay the horrible tragedy that happens to thousands of people or to millions of people every day due to unrelated events like disease, like accidents. The only difference here is the fact that the cause of these tragical terroristic attacks is a complete lack of morality and a barbaristic monster mentality, which makes people much more outraged at it. But a dead person is a dead person, whether you are killed by a terrorist or die from Alzheimer. Personally, I'd rather be blown to bits by a terrorist than get a terrible disease which makes me spend years in pain and retardation. I mean, at least if I get a bomb to my face, it's over in an instant and I won't suffer from it. So really, I would like to call everyone to look at statistics and don't let fear cloud their judgment.
Absolutely, and it's even the case that a person is a lot more likely to get killed by a lightning strike than by an act of terrorism. And it seems to me to call forth, I think, a very important element of widespread human irrationality that we need to consider, and that is the idea that the more familiar and commonplace a peril is, the more likely people are to discount it and try to, in a sense, make peace with it instead of fearing it or trying to avoid it or trying to do something about it. Terrorism is rare and it's sensational, and of course the way in which the damage gets inflicted pulls on a lot of heartstrings. So a lot of people do have this very strong reaction to it, and often an undeserved fear of it, because I agree, for people in the general population, the likelihood of being a victim of one of those attacks is very remote indeed. On the other hand, car accidents, which in the United States alone kill about 35,000 people per year, a lot of people are somewhat resigned to them, unfortunately, and even when a major possibility for alleviating the loss of life from car accidents arises, the emergence of autonomous vehicles. If you talk to ordinary people about them, there's this strange reluctance, or there's this desire to think up of excuses as to why autonomous vehicles might fail, or why they might not be such a good thing, that somehow, oh, manually operating a vehicle cultivates certain skills or certain virtues that people shouldn't lose. And you mentioned rationalizations for death generally, which for our ancestors certainly has not been avoidable. So over millennia, people have constructed these arguments to try to make peace with death, even though a rational thinker who examines these arguments will find after a few minutes they don't make any sense at all. And yet you see 99% of humans, if challenged about the subject of death, still espousing those arguments. So I suppose the biggest question of all in this discussion is, how can we change that mindset, the mindset that might blow an extraordinary peril out of proportion, but almost completely disregard commonplace perils like car accidents, heart disease, cancer, senescence itself, and more generally, death as being the enemy that needs to be fought.
Well, I think what you're talking about is part of a much larger problem, and that's our cultural predisposition to what we call wisdom above intelligence and rationality, which seem to be a similar thing on first look, but they're actually a much different thing, because the thing that the general population considers wisdom usually isn't wisdom at all. It's folk wisdom, it's easily accepted sound bites of obsolete folk psychology, which generally make people feel better about themselves. While intelligence and rationality is something that costs active effort, something that requires individual thoughts, that requires people to think for themselves, to evaluate problems. And on the other hand, you have these culturally ingrained memes, which are easily copied. They provide a sense of higher awareness or intellect or wisdom or whatever, you know. And I think that this whole mentality towards this has to change. We don't like intelligence, and being very smart and educated is often still seen as something nerdy or something not universally valuable. You have like these people who say like, you know, they're not that smart, they don't have a good job, they didn't go to college, but they have other qualities, you know, this kind of thinking where people who really aren't successful in life try to justify this for themselves instead of trying to get ahead in life, because justifying things for yourself is a very easy thing to do. It's a very lazy thing to do, and it requires the least amount of knowledge, of intelligence, and active thought. And this is not a strange thing to see, because obviously people who are less successful in life in one culture where people have more or less the similar opportunities, at least in most Western countries, you have a form of social democracy where most people can get in a position where they're very happy with themselves if they try, if they do their best, and if they have some intelligence. And obviously, people who lack this intelligence will often end up in positions which will cause them to try to justify their failures, which will kind of, you know, end up in a loop. You know, I didn't succeed because I was less intelligent, so I won't value intelligence as much, so I won't develop myself further. You know, and that will cause you to fail again and again and again and again. And learning to deal with these failures is essentially what people call folk wisdom. It's dealing with imperfections and acceptance of imperfections, where that's not what we want to do. We don't want to accept imperfections. We want to make a perfect, more rich, and more valuable life for ourselves, our loved ones, and everyone around us. And to reject this imperative is, to me, to reject the essence of what is being human, of what it is to advance, of what it is to be rational, and to go on a higher level than our tribal ancestors did, which is what has caused all of our arts, our culture, everything really beautiful in life. And we have this sentiment in some people that we have to go back to basic or something like that. And it's really a very sad thing to see, because many people also think that they will lose something by, you know, improving themselves. You know, like you have these mottos like you can't rationalize everything, or you can't logically analyze everything. And I think that these mottos are not just simple, that they're not just wrongly phrased. I think that they're fundamentally misguided, they're fundamentally flawed, and fundamentally harmful to the development of ourselves and our species.
Yes, I agree with you. It seems to me that a lot of the negative cultural influences that we're seeing, the ones that could pose obstacles to the realization of a better future, do indeed stem from the desire to convince people, or from the desire of people to convince themselves that everything is just fine the way it is, because somehow that's seen as comforting. I even think this is one of the primary reasons for the popularity of dystopian science fiction, the idea that if one presents a significantly worse world in the future from whatever causes, be it from runaway technologies or some sort of political dystopia, then that leads the reader or the viewer to come back to his or her own world and say, ah, well, my life is not perfect, but at least it's not that. At least it's not this dystopian future. And if people convince themselves that the future is going to be so much worse than the present, then they might in some strange way make peace with the present. And that's exactly what we don't want them to do. We don't want them to make peace with the present, because the present still has so many problems and so many limitations and so many threats that we need humans to work on resolving. And ultimately, I agree with you, improving oneself and not seeing oneself as a finished product, not trying to validate one's every mistake or every flaw, is an essential component of that improvement if we are to ultimately see a better future and be part of that better future. Then our future as individuals should be improved as well. So I think this has been an excellent discussion to highlight both the possibilities and the obstacles for the future within the next several decades. And I think we've definitely combed through these various aspects in great depth. There's much more that could be said, but I wanted to leave you with the last word on this. Is there anything else that comes to mind for you along the lines of the subjects that we've discussed?
Well, there are a few short points and things that I would like to leave our viewers with. And one of these things is that you don't have to be a great entrepreneur or a world leader to make a change. You can mail your local newspaper with some transhumanist-oriented story. You can bring out news yourself. You can motivate people to look towards new technologies. You can pick up a programming course. You can look on Singularity Hub and make people excited for it. You need to really get the general population to get this feeling of the future is now, And the second thing I would say is that there is never an excuse for not saying the truth, because it offends someone's feelings, because it may be something that people don't want to hear. And I think we have come way too far with not wanting to offend people. Offending someone is not something you do. You don't cause offense. People take offense. It's their responsibility. And, like, for example, what Stephen Fry said, like, you're offended. Well, so what? So what if you're offended? We are all offended at times. And I, as a rationalist, I'm offended every day when I see irrational things in society. I'm offended every day when I see religious zealots stone women or homosexuals. I'm offended every day when someone says that it's acceptable or even desirable that I die. I'm offended every day when I see all kinds of these things in culture. But in a free society, you get used to that. You develop a shield against it. You develop a sense of respect for someone's right to say what they want to say, even if you oppose to death what they're saying. And I think that we have to step away from this whole culture of not trying to offend people, of seeking harmony, because harmony is something much different than peace. Peace means agreeing to disagree at some points and being capable of debating things or being opposed to each other, but live without killing each other, without childish conflicts, economical, physical, or in any other way, while being different. But harmony, or especially politically correct and forced harmony, is a false state of non-growth, of no exchange of ideas, of where truth is made subservient to people's feelings. And I would say speak the truth, speak your minds, and if you offend someone, you've done a good deed because maybe you've taught them about how to protect themselves emotionally from it and expose them to a world which is more likely.
Hello? We seem to have lost you there, Demian. The last thought that I heard was with regard to if you offend a person. Oh, I think your audio is coming back.
Yes? Hello?
Yes, we lost you for a moment there with your audio, but you were talking about how essentially if a person offends you, that may be a learning opportunity to.
Certainly, because in a society where you get offended regularly, as we do, both of us, every day, I assume, or at least every other day, by being confronted with certain things that we wish were different, and nobody really cares about it, you learn to make a shield for it, and you learn to deal with people saying things that you might not agree with. And essentially, if someone says something offensive, the way I try to look at it is, if it is not true, it's not offensive because it's just nonsense. If someone tells me I'm a pedophile, for example, I won't be offended because I know I'm not a pedophile, and the notion of it is completely ridiculous. It's just someone stringing words together that have no meaning. Well, if someone tells me that something about myself which I don't like, which is true, for example, if someone tells me that, let me think about something, that I could show more discipline in doing something where I'm undisciplined, or calls me lazy, that may be a learning point, that may be a moment to sit down and consider why I'm being called these things, and I may improve myself. So in every way, people saying things that you don't want to hear are either good or neutral, in my opinion. And to get mad at them is just a sign of childishness, in my opinion.
Yes, and it seems to me that if people very readily take offense, it's a sign of fundamental vulnerability, insecurity, like whatever it is that was said that offended them was really threatening to them because they're not sure about that particular aspect of their lives. And I think we can see, for instance, in the Islamic fundamentalist fanatics who are ready to kill over cartoons. Well, they're trying to follow a sixth century creed, essentially, in the 21st century, and they are essentially attempting to reconcile the modern world with practices that are completely, let's say, outside the purview of a civilized society. And so they have this cognitive dissonance, and when somebody points it out, it's like a direct threat to their vision of the world, and it's such a discordant vision that they're ready to lash out in violence against it. So I definitely agree that if a person is logical, if a person is committed to self-improvement, then hearing something that isn't 100% agreeable is not going to spark that kind of reaction.
Yes, and in that case, it's better for these people to gain, if they really aren't willing to compromise, I would say it would be better for these people to accept that they are going to be offended, to get isolated by society, and basically to be made very clear that nobody cares about their offense and that society will go on with or without them. And personally, I would say that, how do I make this point? Well, yes, what I wanted to say about it is that I really agree with you on the points of which people often react most viciously at offense. It's usually people who adhere to ideologies, whether this is fundamentalism in religion or in ideology, it doesn't really matter, is because their ideologies are quite weak and easily counteracted with reason. Because they don't have anything but violence. They don't have another defense, and that's a very clear indication of the valuability and the general value of the entire dogma or worldview that these people have, and it should be an indication to society itself that by reacting in this way they disqualify their own position because they prove it to have no adequate rational defense. They only have violence, terror, and intimidation, which not only disqualifies them as people, it doesn't only prove them to be immoral or evil, it also proves that their ideology, or at least their interpretation of this ideology, has no merit in itself, which can be proven on rational grounds.
Absolutely. So I suppose that's going to be, in a sense, the cultural challenge of the next several decades. How to move us toward a society where more people do not take offense so readily. More people are open to arguments and ideas and forms of expression that challenge their own, that challenge their view of the world, and that essentially urge them to some sort of personal growth or some sort of reconsideration of what they're thinking. And Karl Popper, the 20th century philosopher of science, talked about the open society, a society that welcomes this kind of questioning, welcomes this kind of vigorous interaction and debate, as contrasted with a closed society that is built on a set of dogmas typically imposed by some authority and that does not allow for this kind of dissent and indeed clamps down on this dissent, seeing it as a threat to the social order. So we want an open society. That's the kind of society in which technological innovation can flourish as well, because people can consider new ways of doing things, new ways of implementing a particular idea or pursuing a particular goal. So we're definitely in strong agreement there. And I wanted to ask you also, you said you had several points. Are there any other points that you wanted to share as part of this discussion?
Well, these two are the main points that I really wanted to make right now. Of course, there's a lot of things that could be still said, but these are in discussion all of their own, of course. And I think that for today we've given our viewers quite a bit to contemplate on and to maybe agree with or disagree with. And I'm very interested in what our viewers have to think about all these issues. So
wonderful. So
I'd like to leave it at that for now.
That sounds good, and a video recording of this conversation will be available on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/GStolyarovII. That's for G. Stolyarov II. Demian, it was a pleasure to speak with you today for about an hour and 20 minutes, and I'll be certain to try to invite you again for these kinds of conversations, because we can certainly explore these subjects and related subjects in greater depth, perhaps also invite some other speakers, but for the time being, it's been a pleasure, and I wish you a good evening.
Yes, it has, certainly, and I wish you a very good evening as well.
All right. Thank you very much.
You too.